Hey listeners, if you haven't already, join the family by subscribing so you never miss another one of these stories. Let's get to 1,000 subs together. Now relax and enjoy. It all started because I needed the money, plain and simple. The kind of job you take not because you have dreams, but because the bills are due and the daylight hours are reserved for a life you are too tired to live. The graveyard shift security guard at the Crossroads Mall in Ohio. A place that felt less like a shopping center and more like a sarcophagus for dead trends by night. The interview was not much of one. A man named Frank, with a face like a crumpled paper bag and breath that smelled of stale coffee and cheaper cigarettes, just slid a single sheet of paper across his desk. A list typed in a faint, old-fashioned font, and said the job was mine if I agreed to follow the rules exactly, no questions asked. He did not say what would happen if I did not, but the way his eyes avoided mine and the slight tremor in his hand when he pointed to the bottom line for my signature told me everything I needed to know. The rules were strange. I will give you that. They were not your standard watch for fires and deter vandalism type of things. Rule 1 was the first thing that stuck with me. Never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the reflection of anyone you see in the store windows after 2 a.m. If you see a person and then see their reflection, you look away from the reflection immediately. Rule 2 was about the music. The mall's sound system plays a continuous loop of instrumental music. If you ever hear a voice, any voice, singing along to the music, you are to proceed immediately to the security office, lock the door, and do not look out the reinforced glass window until the music returns to normal. Rule 3 involved the fountains. There are 3 decorative fountains in the mall. At the main entrance, the food court, and the north wing, the water must be running at all times. If any of them stop, you are to restart the pump within 5 minutes. If you cannot, you must leave the mall immediately. Do not wait for your shift to end. Just go. Rule 4 was about the mannequins. It stated simply that the mannequins in the window of the old Montgomery Ward Annex are always to be faced away from the main concourse. If you find them turned around, do not touch them. Simply note the time in the logbook and avoid that wing for the rest of your shift. The final rule, Rule 5, was the most unsettling. It said that between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., you may feel an overwhelming urge to go to the children's soft play area, dubbed the kiddie coral. You are forbidden from doing so. No matter what you hear coming from that direction, you must stay at your central post until the feeling passes. I signed the paper, thinking it was all some kind of bizarre corporate liability thing. A way to weed out the superstitious or the unstable. Frank took the paper back, filed it away in a drawer that he locked with a key he wore around his neck, and handed me a heavy flashlight and a set of keys that felt cold, colder than metal should feel. My first few nights were quiet, almost boring. The place was a ghost town. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights in the main walkways, the distant gurgle of the fountains, and that endless, soulless music. It was easy to dismiss the rules. I did my rounds, checking the locks on the grates of every store, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. I would see my own reflection in the dark windows of the closed stores, a lonely figure in a sea of consumer goods, and I would quickly look away, not out of obedience, but because it was just a little too depressing. The Montgomery Ward Annex was a section of the mall that time forgot, a long corridor of stores that had been closed for years, covered in dust sheets. The only active display was the mannequin window, 4 pale. Featureless figures dressed in fashions from another decade. They were always facing the back wall. As per the rules, I never gave them a second thought. The strangeness began subtly. During my 3rd week, I was making my 2M round, walking past the food court, when I noticed the fountain had stopped. The basin was still, the water dark and stagnant, a few pennies glittering at the bottom like dead eyes. I remembered Rule 3. I had 5 minutes. I found the maintenance panel behind a fake potted plant, flipped the switch, and with a grinding groan, the pump kicked back on. Water began to trickle, then flow. I stood there for a moment, watching it, feeling a sense of relief that was out of proportion to the task. That was when I heard it, a sound that was not part of the music, a soft, high-pitched humming. It was tuneless, yet it seemed to weave itself into the bland melody playing overhead. It was coming from the direction of the kiddie choral. I glanced at my watch. It was 2:07 a.m., too early for the witching hour mentioned in Rule 5. I shook my head, attributing it to tiredness, and moved on, but the sound followed me, not literally, but it lingered in my ears, a phantom noise that made the back of my neck feel tight. The next night, I was more on edge. I found myself staring at the reflections in the windows, not just avoiding them, but studying them. The dark glass showed a world that was identical to the one I was in, yet somehow emptier, more profound. I saw my own form moving through the stillness, and once, just once, I thought I saw another shape standing far behind my reflection. A tall, thin shadow that was gone when I turned around. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a fatigue-induced hallucination. The incident with the mannequins happened on a Friday night. The one night the mall stayed open later, so my shift started after the last stragglers had left. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and cleaning chemicals. As I approached the Montgomery Ward Annex, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The mannequins were turned around, all 4 of them. Their blank faces were now pointed directly down the main concourse. Towards me, they were positioned not in a casual display pose, but as if they had been frozen mid-conversation. One had its head tilted, another had an arm slightly raised. The dust on their shoulders was undisturbed, as if they had not been physically moved but had simply rotated in place. Rule 4 echoed in my mind: do not touch them. Note the time and avoid the wing. I fumbled for the logbook I carried. My hands were not steady as I scribbled down the time, 1:15 a.m. I could not just leave them like that. It felt wrong, an invitation for something. Against my better judgment, I walked closer. The silence in that wing was absolute. Even the music seemed faded. I stood before the glass, looking at those smooth, expressionless faces, and I had the most irrational thought that they were looking back at me, not at my body, but at something inside me. I forced myself to turn away, to continue my round, but I could feel those blank eyes on my back until I turned the corner. The following week, the music changed. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was sitting at the central security desk, trying to stay awake. The music was its usual self, a bland orchestral version of some pop song I could not quite place. Then, a voice joined in. It was a child's voice, sweet and clear, singing words that I had never heard before, words that did not match the song. The voice was not coming from the speakers. It seemed to emanate from the air itself, filling the space around me. The lyrics were simple, yet they made my blood run cold. It sang about a game of hide and seek in a quiet mall, about counting down until the doors all lock, about finding a friend who is not really a friend. I did not wait. I remembered Rule 2. I ran to the security office, my heart hammering against my ribs. I slammed the door shut, twisted the deadbolt, and sank to the floor below the window. I pressed my hands over my ears, but I could still hear that voice, faintly, singing about looking in the wrong reflections. I stayed there, curled on the cold linoleum, until the song faded and the familiar, wordless music returned. I looked at my watch. It was 3:58 a.m. I had been in there for over an hour. When I finally dared to stand up and look out the window, the mall was empty, but the feeling of being watched was so intense, it was like a physical pressure. That was the night I broke a rule, the big one. Rule 5. It was a Tuesday, the quietest night of the week. The air in the mall felt heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The music was skipping, a single chord repeating over and over with a faint click in between. I was on edge, jumping at every small noise my own feet made. As the clock on my phone ticked over to 3 a.m., it started not as an urge, but as a pull, a physical magnetism drawing me towards the West Wing, where the kiddie choral was located. It was a deep, primal need to go there, to see what was making the soft, rustling sound I could now hear. a sound like plastic balls being stirred by an unseen hand. I fought it. I gripped the edge of the security desk until my knuckles turned white. I recited my social security number, the names of my old teachers, anything to anchor my mind to reality. But the pull was too strong. It was like a hook had been set deep in my chest, and something was reeling me in. I stood up, my body moving against my will. My footsteps were slow, deliberate. As I walked towards the west wing, the rustling grew louder, mixed with a faint, wet clicking, like a tongue against teeth. The lights in that part of the mall were dimmer. Some were burnt out, casting long, dancing shadows. The kiddie coral was a fenced-off area, filled with colorful plastic tubes and a ball pit. As I got closer, I saw that the balls in the pit were moving, shifting, as if something was burrowing beneath them. I stopped at the fence, my hands gripping the cheap, brightly colored plastic. I peered into the dimness. The rustling stopped, the balls became still, and for a moment, there was only the skipping music and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, from the deepest part of the pit, a shape began to rise. It was not a child. It was something that had the approximate size of a child, but was all wrong. Its skin was the color and texture of the pale, grimy plastic balls, and it seemed to be made of them, shifting and clicking against each other. It had no face, just a shallow depression where features should be, and it turned that blankness towards me. I could not move. I was frozen in a terror so complete it was like being encased in ice. The thing lifted an arm, a limb that seemed to form itself from the balls, and it pointed a single plastic finger not at me, but past me, down the concourse, towards the Montgomery Ward Annex. Then, it simply collapsed back into the pit with a soft, sighing sound, the balls settling over it. The pull was gone, the spell was broken. I stumbled backward, falling onto the hard floor. I scrambled away on my hands and knees until I was far enough to turn and run back to the security office. I locked the door and did not come out until the sun was up and the day staff started to arrive. I thought about quitting, I really did, but the money was good, and a part of me, a part I am not proud of, needed to understand. I started to bring a notebook. I began to document things, the patterns. I noticed that the strange events always happened when the fountains were malfunctioning. The night I heard the singing, the food court fountain had been intermittently stopping and starting all evening. The night of the mannequins, the pump for the north wing fountain had been making a strange knocking sound. It was all connected to the water. I became obsessed with the fountains. I would spend hours just watching them, making sure the pumps were running smoothly. I learned their rhythms, their sounds. I found the main water shut-off valve in a utility closet behind the janitor's supply room. It was an old, large iron wheel. I made sure it was always fully open. One night, about 2 months after the incident at the ball pit, I found it. The main valve was turned halfway off. I had checked it at the start of my shift. It had been fine. No one else was in the mall. I felt a fresh wave of dread. This was not random malfunction. This was deliberate. I turned it back on. The sound of water rushing through the pipes was like a sigh of relief through the entire building. That was when I decided to investigate the Montgomery Ward Annex properly. I had to know what was down there, what the thing in the ball pit was pointing to. I waited until a night when everything was calm. The fountains were flowing. The music was uninterrupted. I armed myself with my heavy flashlight, more for psychological comfort than anything else, and walked down the long, dark corridor of the annex. The air was colder there, and smelled of damp concrete and old paper. I checked every locked door, but they were all secure. The final stretch of the Montgomery Ward Annex felt different that night. The air itself was thicker, a heavy silence that seemed to swallow the distant, tinny music whole. The dust, usually settled, hung in my flashlight beam like a million tiny specters, disturbed by my passage. Each footstep was a trespass, a violation of a peace that was not peaceful at all. It was the quiet of a held breath, and at the very end of that long, dark corridor was the door. I had passed it a dozen times before, always dismissing it as a janitorial closet or an electrical panel. But tonight, It demanded attention. It was made of solid, unpainted metal, cold and industrial, a stark contrast to the cheap wood and smoked glass of the other storefronts. There was no handle, just a heavy, keyed deadbolt, and it was not listed on the bulky key ring Frank had given me, the one with labels like Sears loading dock and food court maintenance. But I remember the master key, a long silver key that felt older than the others, its teeth worn smooth. Frank had pressed it into my hand on my first night, his grip surprisingly strong. For emergencies only, he had said, his eyes boring into mine, and do not tell me what you find. I had tucked it away, thinking it was for some forgotten panic room or the roof access, but now, standing before this cold metal slab, I knew this was what he meant. My hand trembled as I pulled the key from my pocket. The simple act of sliding it into the lock felt monumental. The sound was obscenely loud in the hush, a sharp scrape of metal on metal that echoed down the empty corridor behind me. I hesitated, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to finish my round and pretend I never saw this door. But the memory of the thing in the ball pit, its silent, pointing finger, pushed me forward. I turned the key. The mechanism inside was heavy, resisting for a moment before yielding with a deep, resonant clunk that was not just a sound, but a feeling, a vibration that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. The door was not pushed open. It swung inward on its own, as if the pressure in the corridor was greater than the pressure in the space beyond. And what lay beyond was not a room, but a mouth. A steep staircase carved from rough concrete descended into an absolute blackness that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. A wave of air hit me, so cold and damp it was like a physical blow. It carried a smell that made my stomach clench. It was the smell of a deep, still lake, the kind where the water is too cold for life. A mineral scent of wet stone mixed with something else, something ancient and rotten, like decaying leaves at the bottom of a forgotten well. I pointed my flashlight down the stairs. The beam was a weak yellow eye in the overwhelming dark. It illuminated concrete steps that were slick with a persistent, glistening moisture. The walls were not drywall, but the same rough, poured concrete, streaked with dark, damp patches. I took a first step, and then another. Each one was a conscious effort. My legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through water. The descent felt impossibly long, far longer than the geography of the mall above should have allowed. It was a descent into the earth, into a different time. The air grew colder with every step, the smell stronger, and a new sensation began to prickle at my skin. A low, sub-audible hum that I felt more than heard. A vibration that started in the soles of my feet and traveled up into my jaw, making my teeth ache. Finally, the stairs ended, opening abruptly into a vast, circular chamber. My flashlight beam danced across the space, failing to find the far walls at first. This was no maintenance tunnel. It was too large, too old. The walls were not concrete anymore, but rough-hewn stone, great blocks of it, covered in a thin phosphorescent moss that gave off a sickly, greenish glow. The ceiling was a dome of the same stone, lost in shadows high above. And in the very center of this chamber stood the well. It was a simple, brutal construction, a ring of the same dark, wet stone about 3 feet high, its rim worn smooth by time. Inside was a void, a gaping mouth of pure blackness that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. The humming was loudest here, a deep thrum that resonated in my bones. I forced myself to approach it, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, each one sounding like a final, foolish decision. My flashlight beam shook, casting crazy shadows that danced around the well like malevolent spirits. I pointed the light down into the abyss, but it was useless. The darkness was a solid thing, an entity that refused to be illuminated. I could not see a bottom, but I could hear water, a slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip that echoed up from impossible depths. Each drop sounded like a clock ticking down in some forgotten language. And then my light caught the edge of the stone rim. I saw the carvings. They were not made by any modern tool. They were gouged deep into the rock, a spiraling pattern of symbols and lines that looked vaguely like eyes, or maybe knots. They meant nothing to me. They were alien, ancient, but nestled among them. Scratched into the stone with a newer, sharper tool, perhaps a nail or a knife, were words I recognized. The phrases were crude, desperate, a frantic graffiti against the ancient script. Never acknowledge the reflection. If you hear a voice, leave the mall. Keep the water flowing. The mannequins must face away. Avoid the kiddie coral. Seeing them here, in this place, carved into the very source of the strangeness, made the breath catch in my throat. This was not a list of rules. It was a recipe for containment, a desperate set of instructions scrawled by someone who came before me. Someone who had learned the hard way what happened if you did not. The well was not just a hole, it was a source, and the mall built on top of it was not a coincidence. It was a lid. The fountains were not decorations, they were pressure valves, siphoning off whatever energy seeped up from below, keeping the pressure from building. The reflections in the windows were not echoes of our world. They were glimpses into another, things from the well looking out, using the water and the glass as focal points. The mannequins, with their blank faces and human forms, were not just store displays, they were anchors, perhaps meant to confuse whatever was down here, to present a false image of life. Or maybe they were markers, indicating a boundary that should not be crossed. And the thing in the ball pit, that shifting, plastic horror, it was not a monster seeking to harm me. It was a sentry, a thing cobbled together from the discarded joy of the place. A guardian meant to warn those who were getting too close, to point them toward the truth. It had guided me here, not as a threat, but as a passing of the torch. In that moment of terrifying clarity, I heard a sound from above. A soft, shuffling scrape on the staircase. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. I pointed my flashlight beam toward the stairs, and there they were, the 4 mannequins from the Montgomery Ward display. They stood at the top of the steps, their smooth, featureless faces all pointed down into the chamber, directly at me. They were not moving, they made no sound, but their silence was more threatening than any noise. They were not hostile. I realized they were a guard, a silent witness to my discovery, ensuring that I did not overstep, that I understood the gravity of what I had found. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that my job had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just a night watchman following a strange set of rules to earn a paycheck. I was a warden. My duty was to maintain the delicate balance, to keep the water flowing in the fountains, to turn the mannequins back, to ensure the lid stayed on. It was not about my safety anymore. It was about the safety of everyone who walked those shiny floors under the bright lights of day, completely unaware of the ancient darkness sleeping beneath their feet. I backed away from the well, the humming seeming to intensify for a moment, a final warning. I climbed the stairs, my legs weak. The mannequins did not move as I approached, but I felt their blank gaze on me, a pressure against my skin. I slipped between them, their cold, hard forms brushing against my jacket, and I did not look back. I stepped into the corridor, pulled the heavy metal door shut, and turned the key. The clunk of the lock engaging was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. I have never gone back down those stairs. I still work the night shift at the Crossroads Mall. The money is still good, but that is not why I stay. I stay because I understand now. The rules are not for my protection, they are for everyone else's. And every night, I make my rounds with a new purpose. I listen to the fountains like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. I check the mannequins with a solemn respect. And when I see a reflection in a dark window that is not my own, I simply look away, because I have seen the door, and I know what lies behind it. And some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again. They can only be watched and guarded for as long as it takes.